Happy 70th birthday, Dad. The Sterling Grand Hotel ballroom shimmered with black tuxedos and silk gowns beneath chandeliers worth more than my first apartment ever was. Champagne flowed freely, bubbles catching the light, and the air was thick with luxury perfume and quiet entitlement. I lingered near the back, holding a glass of sparkling water, observing my father, Richard Sterling, as he stepped onto the stage. He looked exactly like the man he believed himself to be, tanned, fit, commanding, wrapped in the kind of confidence only decades of unchecked authority could produce. At his side stood my brother Connor, 35 years old. Vice President of Brand Vision, whatever that title was supposed to mean, dressed in a tuxedo that likely cost 5 figures and still managed to wear him instead of the other way around. My mother, Susan, beamed from the front row, clapping with theatrical enthusiasm. Richard tapped the microphone and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice booming across the vaulted ceiling. 70 years, it makes a man reflect on legacy. On what comes next, he paused, perfectly timed, then placed a possessive hand on Connor's shoulder. That's why tonight I'm proud to announce that, effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Sterling Hospitality Group. The torch passes to my son, Connor. Applause exploded, polished, enthusiastic, ignorant applause from people who didn't know the truth. I didn't clap, I didn't flinch. But Richard continued, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on me, a thin, amused smile curling his lips. "We haven't forgotten everyone. Gabrielle, come up here, sweetheart." I walked to the stage, heels clicking against marble, the room watching as the beautiful daughter approached the throne. Richard handed me a sleek white envelope. "For my brilliant daughter," he said into the microphone, loud enough for the back rows. "Since the men are handling the heavy lifting now, I figured you could use a little rest. A luxury spa package. Relax, find yourself a husband." "You've earned it." Laughter rippled through the room, soft, indulgent, cruel. Connor leaned into his mic with a grin. "Don't worry, Gab. I'll make sure the company's still standing when you're done with your massage." I took the envelope, looked at my father, looked at my brother. And in that instant, the last thread of loyalty I had toward this family dissolved. It wasn't rage that filled me. It was clarity, cold, sharp, absolute. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't flee the stage in humiliation. That was what they expected. That was what the old Gabrielle would have done. Instead, I smiled. It didn't reach my eyes. It was forged from ice and steel. "Thank you, Dad," I said evenly, my voice amplified by the microphone. "I actually have something for you as well." I nodded toward the waiter I'd tipped earlier. He stepped onto the stage carrying a heavy box wrapped in deep blue velvet. Richard's brow furrowed, but his ego wouldn't let him hesitate. He loved gifts. He untied the ribbon, expecting a luxury watch or a rare bottle of scotch. "You shouldn't have," he said. "Oh, but I should have," I replied quietly. "Happy birthday. I got you a very comfortable retirement." He lifted the lid. The smile froze on his face. Inside wasn't a watch. It was a thick stack of legal documents bound in leather. Resting on top was a single page bearing the letterhead of a major law firm. The room went completely still. Even the ice in the champagne buckets seemed to stop melting. Richard picked up the paper. His hands trembled. "What is this?" he whispered, the microphone catching every quiver. "That," I said, leaning in so only he and Connor could see the fire in my eyes, "is formal notice of a hostile takeover. As of this morning, I control 52.4% of Sterling Hospitality's voting shares." And the document underneath is a notice for an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Attendance is mandatory. Connor let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "You're insane. You can't buy a company with a spa voucher, Gab." I turned to him, expression flat. "I didn't buy it with a voucher, Connor. I bought it with the debt you've both been hiding for 3 years. I own the bank loans, I own the vendor liens, and now," I paused, "I own you." Richard dropped the box. Papers scattered across the stage like startled birds. The guests began murmuring, the realization dawning that this wasn't theater. This was an execution. "You ungrateful little," Richard began, his face flushing an alarming shade of red. "Careful, Dad," I cut in. "Stress isn't good for people in your position. Enjoy the party. It's the last one the company is paying for." I turned and walked off the stage. I didn't look back. I moved through the crowd, past stunned investors, whispering socialites and open mouths, and pushed through the double doors. Cool night air hit my face. And for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like spare air. I felt like the queen. But this wasn't impulsive, it wasn't a tantrum. It was the result of 3 years of being underestimated, ignored, and erased. They thought I was just the accountant, the girl buried in spreadsheets while they played golf. They didn't understand that when you control the numbers, you control everything, and I'd been tracking every mistake they made. To understand why I dismantled my family on a live stream, you need to understand a meeting from 3 years earlier. It was a Tuesday. I sat in Richard's office, the air conditioner humming too loudly, a 50-page binder on my lap. I called it the Sterling Survival Protocol. At 29, I was already a senior forensic accountant at a top-tier Chicago firm, cleaning up disasters for Fortune 500 companies. For my father, I worked for free. 6 months of analysis told the truth. The company was hemorrhaging cash. Occupancy was down 45%. The debt-to-equity ratio was catastrophic. I'd identified $2.3 million in recoverable tax liabilities and a refinancing strategy that would prevent insolvency within 18 months. It was airtight. Richard sat behind his desk scrolling his phone. Connor toyed with a Newton's cradle in the corner, its click-clack filling the silence. I finished my presentation. Dad, if we don't execute this by Q3, the banks will call the loans. We lose the flagship property. Richard didn't open the binder. He slid it back across the desk like it was a coaster. You worry too much, Gabrielle, he said with that indulgent smile reserved for children and waitstaff. You're an accountant. You see pennies. I see vision. You don't have the killer instinct. He stood and clapped Connor on the back. Connor's working on a branding partnership with an influencer agency. That's the future. Big picture thinking, Connor grinned, having contributed nothing to the company in his entire life. Yeah, Gab, that was the moment, the glass cliff, and I realized it wasn't just sexism. It was narcissism. Richard didn't want a partner, he wanted a mirror. Connor was perfect, hollow, shiny, reflecting Richard exactly as he wanted to be seen. I wasn't a mirror, I was a microscope. And when you show a narcissist the rot, they don't see competence. They see a threat. I didn't argue. I picked up my binder and walked out. In that elevator ride, I stopped being his daughter. I became an investor. Richard was too busy admiring his reflection to notice he was selling the furniture to pay for the frame. I took my knowledge of those toxic loans and I went shopping. Back at the party, the chaos had migrated to the coat room, the only private space for a screaming match. Richard dragged me inside, face purple with fury. Susan sobbed into silk. Connor leaned against a rack of fur coats, pretending calm while his hands shook. Do you have any idea what you've done? Susan cried. The press is out there. The board is out there. You're destroying the family image. Over jealousy, she added. It's not jealousy, I said calmly. It's business, Richard scoffed. You think paperwork makes you a CEO. You're hysterical, Gabrielle. You didn't get the chair, so you're throwing a tantrum. Connor sneered. We'll have our lawyers look at whatever garbage you printed. By Monday, this'll be a funny story at the club. I looked at them, really looked. There was no fear, no understanding, just the absolute certainty that they were untouchable and I was irrelevant. They honestly thought I was bluffing. That was the green light. That was the permission structure I needed to burn it all down. I didn't buy the company with a voucher, Connor, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And I didn't buy shares on the open market. That would have been too expensive. I walked over to Richard. See, Dad, when you ignored my restructuring plan 3 years ago, I realized something. You didn't just have a cash flow problem. You had a reputation problem. You stopped paying your vendors. You stiffed your contractors. You leveraged the company's assets to buy your yacht and your third vacation home. There were a lot of angry people holding sterling debt. People who were desperate to get anything back. I pulled a small notebook from my clutch, so I made some calls. I found the construction firm you owe $2 million to. I found the linen suppliers you haven't paid in 6 months. I found the silent investors you ghosted, and I bought their debt for pennies on the dollar because, unlike you, they trusted me. They knew I was the only one who could actually turn the ship around. Richard stopped laughing. You can't do that. I did, I said. And because the company is in default on those loans which you hid from the board, by the way, I have the right to convert that debt into equity. As of this morning, those conversions are processed. I didn't just buy your company, Dad. I foreclosed on your ego. The silence in the coat room was heavy, suffocating. Connor looked at Richard. Dad, is that true? Richard didn't answer. He was staring at me like I was a stranger, like he was seeing me for the first time in his life, and he was terrified. I wasn't done. The debt gave me leverage, but leverage is just a tool for negotiation. I didn't want to negotiate. I wanted to terminate. You think this is about bad loans? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the stifling heat of the coat room. Bad loans are civil. What I found 6 months ago, that's criminal. I saw Connor flinch, a tiny involuntary spasm near his eye. He knew, while I was buying up your debt, I continued. I did a deep dive into the operational expenses, specifically the marketing and consultant budget. It was bloated. $40,000 a month going to a firm called Apex Solutions in Nevada. For brand strategy, I stepped closer to Connor. He smelled like expensive scotch and fear. I pulled the incorporation papers for Apex Solutions, Connor. It's a shell company. No employees, no website, just a PO box in Las Vegas. And do you know who the registered agent is? Your college roommate, Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Connor, what is she talking about? It gets better, I said, turning to my father. I traced the transactions. The money went from Sterling accounts to Apex, and then directly to 3 offshore sports betting sites and a private creditor in Macau. You weren't spending 40 grand a month on marketing, Connor. You were paying off gambling debts. Connor looked at the floor, his face pale. It was a temporary cash flow issue. I was going to put it back. That's embezzlement, Connor. I said that's 15 years in federal prison. But here is the part that actually broke me. Here is the part that made me decide to take the company instead of just fixing it. I looked Richard dead in the eye. I found the approval signatures on those wire transfers. You signed them, Dad, you knew. You knew he was stealing from the company, stealing from the shareholders, from the employees, from me, and you signed off on it as marketing expenses to cover his tracks. Richard stayed silent, his jaw clenched tight. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. You protected the thief because he was your son, I said, letting the disgust saturate every word. And you fired the fixer because she was your daughter. That was your mistake, because now I have the forensic audit, I have the bank records, I have the proof of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single USB drive. I held it up. It caught the light like a bullet. This drive contains the entire file, I said, by 8 a.m. Tomorrow this goes to the SEC and the FBI, unless you do exactly what I say. You wouldn't, Susan whispered. He's your brother, he's your father, you wouldn't send them to jail. Try me, I said. I've spent 3 years being invisible to you people. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The next morning, the Sterling Hospitality boardroom was colder than a morgue. The heavy oak table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the gray Chicago sky outside. The board members, 7 old men who had played golf with my father for 30 years, sat in uneasy silence. They had received my emergency summons at midnight. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know the empire had already fallen. I sat at the head of the table, my father's chair, at 8 a.m. Sharp, the double doors opened. Richard walked in. He was wearing a fresh suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, trying to project the image of the untouchable king. Connor walked a step behind him, looking like a ghost. Gentlemen, Richard boomed, forcing a smile, I apologize for this irregularity. My daughter seems to be under the impression that sit down, Richard, I said. I didn't shout, I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke with the absolute authority of the person holding the gun. One of the board members, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. Richard Gabriel has provided us with documentation regarding significant ownership changes and some concerning financial irregularities. Richard froze. He looked at me. I tapped the laptop in front of me. The projector screen behind me lit up. It wasn't a slide deck. It was the gambling ledger. Pages of wire transfers, betting slips, and Richard's signature authorizing the cover-up. This I addressed the board as evidence of systematic embezzlement and fraud totaling $1.4 million over 3 years, authorized by the CEO, executed by the VP of Brand Vision. The room erupted shouts of, "Is this true?" and "My God, Richard." I stood up. The noise died down instantly. I have acquired 52.4% of the voting shares through the purchase of distressed debt converted to equity. I stated calmly, I am the majority shareholder. I am moving for the immediate termination of Richard Sterling and Connor Sterling for cause effective immediately. You can't do this. Connor screamed, his voice cracking. Dad, tell them. Richard slumped into the nearest chair. He looked at the screen. He looked at the board members who were now looking at him with a mixture of horror and fury. He realized there was no spin that could fix this. I have a proposal, I said, looking down at my father. Option A, you and Connor are terminated for cause. I hand this digital file to the federal authorities waiting in the lobby. You leave here in handcuffs, and the Sterling name becomes synonymous with fraud. Richard flinched. Option B, I continued. You both resign immediately, citing health reasons. You surrender your remaining equity to the company to cover the embezzled funds. You sign NDAs and you walk out of here. No pension, no severance, but no prison. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 10 seconds that ended a dynasty. Please, Richard whispered. It was the first time I had ever heard him beg. Gabrielle, think about the family reputation. I looked at the man who had given me a spa voucher while handing his kingdom to a thief. I looked at the man who had erased me for 32 years. The reputation is dead, Dad, I said, closing the laptop with a final snap. I'm just burying the body. Richard signed the resignation papers with a shaking hand. He didn't look at me. He walked out of the boardroom, a broken old man leaning on his criminal son for support. As the door clicked shut, I sat back in the leather chair. It was comfortable. It fit perfectly. It has been 6 months since I walked out of that boardroom. The transition was brutal, efficient, and absolute. Richard and Susan retired to a 2-bedroom condo in Boca Raton. It is a nice condo. I pay for it. I also control their monthly stipend. It is enough to play golf and drink margaritas, but not enough to buy influence or launch a counterattack. I keep them comfortable, but I keep them contained. They call sometimes, usually when the allowance runs low, but I have an assistant who handles that. I don't speak to them. I can't. Connor is in a rehabilitation center in Malibu. I paid for that too, not because I forgive him, but because it was the cleanest way to remove him from the board without a messy public trial. He signed over his remaining equity in exchange for avoiding prison. He sends me letters, sometimes rambling about how he's finding himself. I archive them without reading. I stand on the balcony of the penthouse suite at the Sterling Grand. The city lights of Chicago stretch out below me like a grid of diamonds. The air is cold, sharp, and clean. This is the view Richard loved. This is the view he thought belonged to him by divine right. Now it belongs to the daughter he tried to buy off with a spa voucher. But here is the truth nobody tells you about winning. Here is the price of the crown. It is quiet up here, a heavy, thick silence that presses against your eardrums. When you cut off the people who share your DNA, you don't just lose the toxicity. You lose your history. You lose the people who remember you as a child. You become an orphan by choice. There are nights when I look at my phone and feel the phantom limb of my family. I wonder if I was too harsh. I wonder if I could have fixed it without burning it down. But then I remember the coat room. I remember the laughter when I was handed that envelope. I remember 3 years of being invisible while I saved their empire. And I realize that the silence isn't loneliness. It's peace. It is the sound of no longer having to beg for a seat at the table. It is the sound of dignity. I didn't lose a family. I escaped a cult of personality. I built my own table carved from the wreckage of their ego. And while it might be a table for one right now, at least I know I earned the chair. I take a sip of my wine, a vintage Richard had been saving for his diamond jubilee. It tastes like victory. If you have ever had to build your own table because they wouldn't give you a seat, share this story. Let's remind the world that worth is built, not inherited.